We would be remiss if we didn't really be visible about the changing landscape, some of which is political, some of which is cultural, in these attacks almost of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, one of the places that I wanted to start is where I've seen since 2000 kind of this evolution. It feels like somewhat of a bell curve. Not that DEI has completely been thrown away, but it definitely feels like a pendulum swing that I wanted to make sure that we were really transparent with you about as you become or continue to reinforce your role in your organizations as diversity, equity, inclusion advocates. So, as I'm sharing with you this journey, for those of you who have been in your own journey, I would love to hear from you as well about, kind of what are those high and low points and what you've been experiencing as well. And so I'll start with where I believe diversity really started. That it was centered in HR. And what you would hear more often than anything was, especially from the C suite, anybody who had control of budget or funding or organizational control, they would ask you, what's the business case for diversity? And so people would actually, go to great lengths putting together their business case for diversity. And sometimes it would just be a couple paragraphs. Sometimes I saw full essays trying to lobby their leadership team for resources, for commitment, for connection to their like goals. And so it was that period lasted for a significant amount of time. What I also then saw was some resistance. And so two things happened. Diversity became diversity and inclusion. And so for two reasons. One, there was some evolution to the body of work, but I believe there were a lot of practitioners who were also trying to find a way to make it more palatable and counteract the resistance to diversity. And so it was diversity and inclusion. And then you saw equity added to it. So diversity, inclusion, equity. So we are a society of acronyms. And if you read it in that order, diversity, inclusion, equity, the acronym is DIE. Probably not the acronym that you want to use. And so the order was switched to diversity, equity, and inclusion so that when we make it an acronym, because we make everything an acronym, that the acronym actually became diversity, equity, and inclusion. So here we go into the evolution. Well, it actually starts to take root with a lot of organizations. And so, where it had been a manager and someone just in HR, we started seeing C-suite level positions for diversity, equity, inclusion, where it was operationalized, not just in HR. You will still see a lot of organizations where you'll see a person's title that's chief HR officer and chief HR and diversity officer, which combined specifically in HR and not in a freestanding C-suite role. But you started seeing real C-suite placement so that that particular role could really have influence across the organization. So we're growing, we're making momentum. And then the summer of 2020 happened. And so would love to hear from anybody if you have opinions about what happened during the summer of 2020. Say two things: COVID, most definitely, but also the murder of George Floyd. As COVID cases began to rise, it became apparent that COVID was really exponentially impacting underserved communities, minorities, people who already had existing health issues, people who were low income who didn't have access to good nutrition and health care. And so there was just an adverse disparate impact among those communities who were already underrepresented. As we move into May and June, the murder of George Floyd, what we started seeing was this outcry of American society, to the extent that organizations officially began commenting about diversity and equity inclusion in ways that hadn't happened before, either because they had been silent completely, not participating in any conversations, or that they had been somewhat participative, but not necessarily advocates. And so I think about some of the companies that really stood out for me. Ben and Jerry's was one of the first companies. Patagonia was one of the companies. Coca-Cola, Delta. But then you also started to see this global movement across the entire world around this concept of Black Lives Matter, and it helped raise and elevate conversations about people who had not just been historically excluded, systematically excluded from just basic access to housing, to education, to healthcare, and companies really started taking stock of what had been happening in society. Ultimately, that became evident in some of the ways that we just live our lives naturally. Let me give you an example. I have a friend who works for Deloitte, and Deloitte decided to really take a hard look at some of their hiring practices. You know, who was represented, who was underrepresented, who was marginally represented. And part of their review also included a equity relative to total compensation. So not just salary, but also benefits. My friend was among a group of women who, after the equity review, received a 17% increase in her base salary to make sure that there was parity with their peer group. Now, as a compensation leader, compensation leaders have always had access to compensation data. Why did it take the murder of George Floyd for organizations to take the time to review their compensation, to clearly identify we have been intentionally undervaluing people who don't look like what had been considered the majority? With this pendulum swing, we also saw something that wasn't positive that was happening. And you saw this term performative allyship, that companies would simply post a picture, post a word, post some banners. But if you started looking into their company, nothing about what was actually happening in their company was representative of what they were saying. And some employees actually started calling them out for that. Culturally, and then I will also say politically, the word woke started being villainized. So let me bring some context to this word. Every culture, subculture has vernacular. Skateboarders have a language. Moms who bake have a language. But within the Black culture, there was this term woke. And what it meant was I'm aware, like I'm paying attention. I am putting pieces of information together. Well, the word started being villainized and then associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it started serving as a detractor to diversity, equity, and inclusion, to the extent that we now have, either by states or by institutions, attempts to dismantle diversity, equity, inclusion altogether. Most recently, the University of Florida terminated the entirety of their diversity, equity, and inclusion office. Now, there is blowback from all of that because of the impacts that it has across the organization. And so while I have watched and I've always understood the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there were organizations who never valued it, never attempted to do anything, created things, but as decoration, waiting for the hashtag to wane, are those who completely from day one objected to it. And so as we spend time together over these next 6 sessions, I don't want us to be naive at all that this is still, even in 2024, after 24 solid years of diversity, equity, inclusion, clearly being at the table and a point of conversation, there is still real debate and resistance about the value of making sure that you see everybody, people feel valued, respected, and heard. You're being mindful about who your customers, your client base are relative to products or services, that debate is there and it is pervasive. So wanted to share this as part of our foundation, but certainly would like to hear from anybody who has just any thoughts or feedback about this kind of as the journey when you think about the evolution of diversity, equity, and inclusion.